A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John up on a high mountain to be alone with them. And before their eyes, Jesus was transfigured, his face becoming as dazzling as the sun, and his clothes radiant as light. Suddenly, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, conversing with Jesus. Then Peter said, "Rabbi, how good that we are here. With your permission, I will erect 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Peter was still speaking when suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. Out of that cloud came a loud voice that said, "This is my own, my beloved, on whom my favor rests. Listen to him." When they heard this, the disciples fell to the ground, overcome with fear. Jesus came toward them and touched them, saying, "Get up, do not be afraid." When they looked up, they did not see anyone but Jesus. As they were coming down the mountainside, Jesus commanded them, "Do not tell anyone about this until the chosen one has risen from the dead." The good news of salvation. Good evening. It's nice to see many of you for a second night in a row after that lovely potluck. Thank you, Jimmy and Andrew, for organizing. The Larkins trace back to Western Ireland, where lamb is the staple dish. So it was a great pleasure to cook lamb for all of you. Tonight, we join the church in celebrating the feast of the Transfiguration. For the liturgy of the word, we're invited to ponder Matthew's account of the Transfiguration, the prophet Daniel's vision of a throne room, and a snippet from the second epistle attributed to Peter that also mentions the Transfiguration. Many of you know the story well. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up to the mountain, and then, in a startling moment, Jesus begins to glow like a fireball. God speaks from a loud cloud, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And upon hearing this, the disciples fall to their feet and are terrified and frightened. There are so many directions that we can go with the Transfiguration tonight. But the aspect that I want to focus on is fear. Because Matthew, in this gospel, is actually making a very complex point here about fear and the divine, which I think is the point that Jesus was originally making too. As is so often the case, there are nuances in the Greek that do not make it over into English. Our words frightened and fear are nice, good, old Saxon words, which describe becoming suddenly stricken with a panicked feeling. But that is not what Matthew is saying. Now, in the Spanish-speaking world, it is customary to render this passage "Gritamos en gran manera." And I'm sorry, I cannot shake an Italian accent when I speak Spanish. Some of you know why. Speaking of Italian, this passage is rendered a bit differently in Italian. I fiori impresi di gran timore. Both the Spanish and Italian translations trace back to, predictably, the Old Latin, timeo, which literally meant feeling darkened. And of course, that is the Latin word that Jerome used in the Vulgate for this passage. And we've got all these words in Romance languages that play with fear as a dark mystery, like tenebrio in Spanish or tenebrae in modern Italian. Cute as these dark metaphors are, they are not Matthew's words. And they get us no closer to his intentions. As some of you who are native Spanish speakers in the room know, there are certain feelings that simply cannot be expressed in English. Same goes for Italian, and the same goes for Greek. So I really want to dig in here. What exactly is Matthew saying the disciples felt after witnessing the Transfiguration? I am not going to go into all of the various different words for fear in Koine that Matthew might put. Although those of us who are glutton for punishments with Greek find it quite telling which word Matthew did pick. And that word is, wait for it, ibothesio, which is a past tense verbal conjugation of that old Greek stem word phobos, which you might recognize because phobia descends from it. In Homer, phobos and its variant words are used when a soldier is intimidated by an overpowering and stronger enemy. And the soldier feels a sudden urge to run, to flee. So phobos is that feeling of awe and grandeur at this power that is menacing and threateningly stronger than in ancient literature in Greek. This word phobos pops up when a mere mortal has that rare experience where a god descends down from Olympus and reveals their divinity in all their terrifying glory. And very often it is too much for the poor chap to handle. The old ancient Greeks wanted their gods to be closer to them, but then became struck with terror, fear, awe, and phobos when they did in fact come face to face with these powers that were so much greater and stronger than them. And this Greek word, phobos, its mixture of fear and awe, is predominantly used when scholars in Alexandria turned the Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament into a Greek translation. And in the Old Testament in Greek, we have several passages where God or an angel fills a witness with fear and awe and phobos. Poor Daniel, the prophet after whom I'm named. We read tonight of the visions that he had of the throne room. And Daniel saw a lot else besides that throne room. And Daniel, you might not know this because this is not the part of Daniel we read up here. Daniel was often very terrified and very uncomfortable with his visions. And of course, the word phobos pops up in the Greek translation of Daniel. When Jesus revealed himself in this moment of transfiguration, and I do believe that this actually happened, it was a commentary on the conundrum of fear. As we read tonight, most of the disciples were not ready to encounter Jesus in his full divinity and full radiance. It was simply too terrifying. So a smaller group was picked. So Jesus had to, if you're going to forgive me the expression, Jesus had to keep his divine nature on the down low for most of his public ministry. It would have been too terrifying, too awe-inspiring, too phobos-inducing if he walked around Judea like a glowing light all the time. And so it was a great act of mercy that Jesus, as the Son of God, chose to be more subtle. But as merciful as this subtlety is, this subtlety is not always easy for us. Don't we all doubt God sometimes? Haven't we all wondered if God is really there? Perhaps we felt doubt this past week as we learned about a man named O'Shea Sibley, who happens to be Black and gay, who was stabbed to death at a gas station not very far from our church for voguing with his friends. Or perhaps there were other items in the news or challenges this week at home, at work, at school, or with our families and communities that led us to doubt that God is there. But what's really going on in all of these doubts is that we're mad at God for not being more obvious, for not being more explicit. And all of us secretly wish that Jesus was a light bulb. The irony is that God's power is so insanely awesome that if we actually got our wish to be totally aware of it, it would be incredibly terrifying, frightening, foibles. This is the dilemma of the fear of God, as understood by the ancients, that Jesus' transfiguration dramatizes. This invitation to fear God as a punishing parent is such a deep misrepresentation. On a deeper level, we are all enduring God's painful and irritating subtlety. Today, we read an account of the Transfiguration, long attributed to Peter in the second epistle. When trying to explain how an illiterate Aramaic fisherman ends up with a letter in his name in polished Koine Greek, St. Jerome suspected that a secretary must have dictated it. We will never know if Jerome was right or if someone else who could actually write Greek put their name on the letter. But the point of this epistle, which Jimmy read, whoever its author is that even if we didn't see Jesus on the mountain like Peter, we've all experienced our own moment where God scared the hell out of us. And something happened that was too improbable and too out there to be anything but God's awesome power. And in this letter, Peter is saying we've got to hold on to that during the dark times when God is so irritatingly subtle. It is hard to endure the subtlety of God. We doubt, and we doubt. And it's also hard to endure the foibles of God, the shock and awe. But bizarrely, I found a way out in St. Augustine. Big surprise. Augustine, you might be surprised to hear this. Augustine was not a fan of fearing a wrathful, punitive God. He didn't think that works. What Augustine said we should really be afraid of is losing our connection with God. But it's not easy to connect with God's subtlety, is it? But I'm telling you that if you're willing to put in the work, which is something Peter knew a lot about, and you're willing to put up with Jesus, it's going to pay off. Amen.